Welcome back to another episode of the 10 Code Mindset Podcast. I'm your host, Scott Medlin, and I'm very excited to announce that Chuck Gilliland is joining me on this episode. He is a retired police sergeant, chaplain, and great leader with the awesome organization American Warrior Association. And Chuck is going to talk about the Bible and moral injury. Now, how the heck does the Bible address moral injury? To which moral injury is one of those things that first responders may have heard the term before, but do they really understand what it is? So we're going to dive into that. Let's walk by faith and enjoy this episode featuring Chuck Gilliland. Well, Chuck, I'm really honored to have you on the show, and I appreciate this very much. You worked in law enforcement for a long time, so if you can just please give us a Cliff Notes version of your career and really the experiences that helped to shape you during your time at Dallas Fort Worth.
Absolutely. I started with Dallas in 1990, worked in Southeast Dallas, where I had 2 good years working in just kind of a really violent part of town, highest crime rate in town. But those 2 years were foundational for the rest of my career, and I owe so much to the city of Dallas. I absolutely loved it. But after 2 years, I left and I went to DFW Airport. And truth is, I went for the money. The pay at DFW Airport Police Department was quite a bit better. We were cross-trained at the time, so I did put in 2 years with the fire service. So I was cross-trained at the time, and I like to tell all the hose draggers that I know a little bit about what they go through sometimes as well. But did 25 years with DFW, spent 17 of those as a supervisor. And it was there about 10 years in that I met a guy from Fort Worth named David Walters, and he introduced me to the Fellowship of Christian Peace Officers. I joined that, and that, and plus a mission trip to Botswana really turned my life around. My wife and
Wow.
I we went to China and Botswana, and we're just looking to see where God wanted us to serve. And the last day at Botswana, I'd taken a case of Bibles and I wanted to go to the main police station there in Gaborone and just pass out Bibles. And it's a long story. I won't go into it, but it was very successful. Got to pray with the chief for his whole department. Got on the plane, and on the way back, I was just praying. I was like, Lord, we've seen a couple of places. Where do you want us to serve? And I'm not kidding. This verse came into my head, and it was like, I'm going to send you to Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, and the ends of the earth. And I was like, awesome. And he was like, why are you skipping to the ends of the earth when you haven't taken care of Jerusalem? You haven't taken care of your own backyard. And that really stuck with me. I went home, started an FCPO chapter at DFW Airport. We started getting officers from all over the place. And then a year later, I got invited to the board of FCPO, which expanded from my Jerusalem to all of a sudden my Judea. And AWA has taken me into what I feel like is Samaria. So God has been really faithful with that. We started with, he said, go back home, take care of your backyard. Then we'll look at doing some ministry work outside your borders. So, and long story short, I was a cop for 30 years. Absolutely loved it. I finished my career with Tarleton State University. I'd retired after 28 years. I came home and decided, I don't want to sit here. So I went back to work for a couple of years. And then after that, I was like, okay, now I'm ready to just kick back. And I thought that's all I was going to do. But God led me to AWA, and bam, here I am.
Well, that was definitely profound. Due to the fact that you did work at Dallas for a little bit and then you worked a lot of years at Dallas Fort Worth, I have to ask, I'll never forget working night shift one night in 2016 and then learning that five Dallas officers were ambushed and
Oh,
killed.
yeah.
And it was very tragic. Can you speak, since you were in that area or,
Yeah.
native to that area or worked there in that area for a long time, can you speak just how damaging that was and how traumatic that was, how the community came together? And if any law enforcement officer ever experiences the sudden loss of a coworker due to something like that, how do you get through? Because it just, I don't know if we can put it into words, but we're going to do our best, right?
Right. I absolutely remember it. It was July 7th of 2016. I mean,
Yeah,
I will
yeah.
never forget that date. And I was off duty that day. I was sitting at home, and my wife and I were watching TV, and all of a sudden, because we live 2 hours south of Dallas, so all our TV stations are still the Metroplex, the Dallas area TV stations. And man, it came on, and all of a sudden, full coverage. I'll be honest, I don't cry much, but man, I cried that night. I knew one of the guys when I was at Dallas. When I got off training, Dallas has a program where you've got what's called Big T, where you have an FTO for six months. Then you go on Little T, where you're out of training, but you still have to ride with a partner. So when I was on Little T, I rode with one of those guys for, maybe 2 months. We weren't real good friends, but we were acquaintances and I knew him. But man, going back to work, just lots of officers, and that was a period where officers were still getting ambushed, and we had talked about that a lot. We had a lot of opportunity to minister to some of our friends in Dallas. I had a friend who had just started an FCPO chapter in Dallas, and I talked to him at length about it. And we even had an opportunity at one point to go to Dallas. I'm trained in critical incident stress management, and we were on standby to go to Dallas and go to some of the substations and talk to the officers who were affected by it. We didn't actually get called, but man, I was so nervous because I didn't know how I would react because it was so raw. Those guys were there protecting the actual protesters against crowds coming in that were angry because they were protesting against law enforcement. So they were there protecting the guy who actually turned and shot and killed some of them. Man, that was some. We've had a Dallas officer too in some of our programs that were on and talked to them, and it is long-lasting moral injury.
Yeah, I'll never forget it. I was working that night shift when we learned about it, and the power actually went out in a certain part of the city where I worked, and it was just a very bad feeling. I mean, we were just aching for Dallas, and then it was just kind of an eerie night for all police officers across the country that night, and at least that's what it felt like. It was so
Absolutely.
bad, but we rise together, and it was great to see the amount of support that was showing up from former presidents showing up, and
Yeah,
all kinds of people, just all kinds. So anyway, I had to ask you about that since you,
absolutely.
yeah, had to ask you about that. But I did want to get to what you're doing now. You kind of touched on it, but what really did lead you to working with AWA? I mean, I know you said it was God calling you, but was it a
Yeah.
connection, or how'd the opportunity come about?
It absolutely was. I've got a friend of mine who I worked with at DFW Airport, and I didn't know, but after I'd retired, he had heard about AWA and went on a trip as a program participant. While he was there, he fell in love with the program, decided that he wanted to help out, and so he became a volunteer with AWA. And at the time, they were real heavy into military. AWA's only been around for about 5 or 6 years. They started out with really Rangers and SEALs, and I mean just special forces guys, but quickly expanded to all military and veterans. And then about midway through 2023, David Hornsby, this friend of mine, calls me up and says, "Hey, I know FCPO has this broad reach, and AWA is trying to reach out to more police officers right now. Do you think it would be possible for AWA and FCPO to partner and advertise for each other?" And so I said, absolutely. I talked to my director. He talked to his director. So I went to have lunch with Anna Hale, who is the director of AWA. And over the next couple of months, we worked out this partnership. And she offered me a trip. She said, "Hey, why don't you come out and see what we do?" And I was like, I would love to. So I have just retired from Tarleton after 30 years. And I really thought God had called me to just sit here in my cozy little office and write books and do devotionals and things like that. But I came home, and again, it's just sometimes God gives me a verse, and I know it's not from me. I'm not smart enough to think of those, but God put this verse, or he put on my heart. He's like, "I don't want you just to sit in your office and do nothing. I want you to get out and get your hands dirty and love on people." So anyway, I went on a trip in October of 23. I was sold. I mean, just I saw the help, and I saw guys open up. They got vulnerable. They got some tools, and by the end of the week, they were just you could tell there was life change in these guys.
Could you kind
We
of dive into what the trip is, what that week-long trip is?
Absolutely. Monday is a travel day, but we get there usually about 3 or 4 in the afternoon. We have a welcome session and go put our stuff up, have dinner, and then all of a sudden, the first session of night one, we talk about our identity. And as a cop, my identity was so tied up in my law enforcement career. Oh, I was a cop and I did this, and I worked for Dallas and all this. And then halfway through the session, it changes. What is your identity in Christ? What is your spiritual identity? And so then we started talking about whose we are instead of who we are. And I'm a child of God. I was fearfully and wonderfully knit in my mother's womb. He has plans for me. And the whole part of it was letting everybody know, whether you're in the military, whether you're fire, EMT, or police officer, the job that you do, you are actually called to by God. And if God has called you to do this job, obviously it's something that he's proud of and he wants you to do. And the first time I ever heard that God was proud of the work I did, it was just mind blowing. God's proud of me? Oh my gosh. But anyway, so day two, we get into moral injury. And then from that point on, all the way through Thursday, we talk about these tools for healing, these things that we can do to help us with moral injury, because moral injury is a battle of the mind. So we start talking about truth and foundational truth, because that's how we get our minds straight. We quit listening to the lies of I'm not worthy, I'm not good enough. Oh, you don't know what I've done. I've done some really bad things. Well, when we start listening to the truth and we realize God's proud of us, it really changes us. You take every thought captive to the obedience of Christ. And when you start taking every thought captive, and for cops, that means you arrest every thought. And when you arrest it, you bring it in and you see if it's a good thought or a bad thought. If it's a bad thought, you throw it into jail and you move on. You go back out and start answering calls and you start taking other thoughts in. Just seeing the healing, the tools of community, and iron sharpens iron, and there's just so many tools that we use, that guys, by the time we get done Thursday, they've got all this new information, they're believing the truth, they're trying to get rid of the lies, and all of a sudden they're not healed from moral injury, but they know how to deal with it, how to deal with the stress and the anxiety that they feel. And it's just it's such a positive experience that it doesn't just end after the week. It's not just this great spiritual week. I go home and I feel great. Our groups stay connected. And I know I'm taking a long time, but in my first group, we had a guy that just, I'm not going to tell his name because I haven't had permission to do so, but just a great guy. He didn't want to be there. First day, he was angry because his wife made him come. He told us while he was at the airport, he almost just walked away from the group and decided to get a hotel and just stay in LA for 5 days and then fly home and tell her he went on the trip. By the end, he was smiling, he was happy, he was talking about, man, I can't wait to get home and start practicing and using these tools I've got. Well, about 3 months later, he came down with brain cancer, and it's been bad. He doesn't have much longer to live, unfortunately, but our group has come together. We go down and we visit him. We talk to him all the time on the phone, text him about once a week. He'll send me an update and I'll send it out to the group. But anyway, we've got these groups that every group has, participants have when they go out. And it's amazing how we stay in contact. We share verses, we share struggles. Sometimes guys will ask questions. Man, I had this situation. Does anybody remember what tool we were given to use for this? When I start, all of a sudden I've got a panic attack. What do I do for that? And the stuff we learn at AWA, we can use to deal with that every single day. So
Yeah, no, it absolutely did, but I did want to dive more into moral injury. What is that? If you need to look up the formal definition on Google, go ahead, but I know you're familiar enough with it to talk about it. So what is moral injury?
yeah, moral injury is something that is, everybody has a moral injury, whether it was something that happened in your childhood. Your mom or dad may be the cause of a moral injury. Dad may have left when you were young, and it just left that void, and maybe you're angry at dad. So everybody's got moral injury. It's common, and which is another great tool that we use. Once we learn it's common and everybody has it, we can all open up and start talking about it. But it's a normal reaction to an abnormal situation. And the reason AWA reaches out to military and first responders because of moral injury is because the more moral injury that you get, it just collects. And if you don't deal with it, it's always up there. Because, you see, think of a fireman who pulls up on a bad accident and somebody passes away and they find out their father, or, oh my gosh, if there was children in the house when there was a fire. The EMT who picks up somebody who has a heart attack and tells the mom and the children, y'all got to meet us at the hospital. you can't go in the box with us, and the guy dies on the way, or the police officer who sees the shooting and some of the inhumanity that man does to other men, the military guys who come back from serving in Iraq, Afghanistan, they see so much more of this on a daily basis that it impacts them more. And that's why we focus on military and first responders for this. But because it's common, 1 Corinthians 10:13 says, no temptation has seized you except that which is common to man. But when you are tempted, God has provided a way out so that you may endure it or stand up under it. And then going that, knowing that biblical foundation that it is just common to all of us helps. But then Ezekiel 44:23 says, they are to teach my people the difference between holy and common and show them how to distinguish between the unclean and the clean. So the reason that it is faith-based is because there are biblical principles that will help us to deal with some of this stress. It's all in the Bible. And like I said, we go back to truth because the Bible is truth. And I like to use the example. I can come home and tell my wife, you know what, I've been listening to some podcasts and reading some stuff, and I don't believe in gravity anymore. And my wife will kind of laugh at me and go, well, that doesn't make sense because that's gravity is there. You can't deny it. The Bible's the same way. The Bible is absolute truth, and you can deny it all day long, but the fact is, it is absolute truth, and it is an instruction for our lives, and it deals with moral injury in such a great way. There's so much in the Bible about moral injury that we can use to help us as tools.
Awesome. Are there any, in addition to the Bible, are there any other practical steps someone can deal with and cope with, manage the symptoms or the fallout of moral injury?
Absolutely. My daughter is a professional counselor in Dallas, and she and I compare notes all the time because she comes at it from a clinical perspective, and I come at it from a spiritual perspective. And the funny thing is, we have found that we agree on the tools and the way to help people with moral injury, but the secular world uses different tools than the biblical or the spiritual, the faith-based world, basically. But we all agree on the ways that we treat. Some of the ways, honestly, and I use this with my guys, a human being, there was a study that said if you write for 15 to 20 minutes a day for 4 days in a row, and you're honest and sincere when you write, and you write about your moral injury, that in those 4 days you can get as much healing from that as you can from 2 days or 2 years of therapy. And this was not a biblical or religious study. This was a secular study that said writing it down simply helps. When I went to critical incident stress management, I went to basic and I went to the advanced schools. And there's three things they teach, and they will tell you this is not a ministry, this is not a discipleship program. So take religion completely out of it. So that's the perspective they go through. But they say there's three main things that help somebody with moral injury, and that is you have to speak, you have to tell somebody what happened, you have to write it down, and then you have to stay hydrated. And that always confused me. I was like, okay, I get speaking it, I get writing it, but stay hydrated. Well, your brain works a whole lot better if you're hydrated. You think better, you're able to communicate better. Well, about a year later, I was going through the Bible, and all of a sudden it dawned on me, all three of those things are biblical principles. You confess it. And there's something about writing it down that concretes it in your head. And then the water, Christ is living water. Jesus Christ is living water. And I'm not trying to preach to anybody, but the fact is, he is the great physician. And through that living water, you can get healing and you can get some just amazing success through this program. And so, again, that's a big part of why we're faith-based.
Absolutely love it. And thank you for that. And,
Yeah.
kind of switching gears a little bit, let's talk about you, Chuck. You're an author. I think you have a book that's up and coming. Please dive into that.
Well, I have written a couple of books when I started in 2012. I grew up with dyslexia. Okay. I mean, it's just typical dyslexia. So I always believed that lie. Again, we go back to moral injury and the battle of the mind. I always believed that lie that I just wasn't smart because I didn't understand a lot of things. It was hard for me to read, hard to write, blah, blah, blah. Fast forward 2012, I'm on the board of FCPO and the executive director says, "Hey man, people are calling, police departments are calling, and they say, is there some kind of biblical Bible study for law enforcement?" And at the time, Mike Dye had written a book called Peacekeepers, but it was the only thing out there. So I'm sitting around with this table with board of directors, and we're all agreeing, yeah, yeah, somebody needs to write this. Somebody needs to write this. And we're looking at each other, and I'm laughing, going, I got dyslexia. It's not going to be me. And man, I got home and God just really put it on my heart. And so I was like, well, I'll give it a shot. I was more like Moses going, but I stutter. And God was like,
Right.
just do it. So anyway, wound up writing the Gospel of Matthew through the eyes of a cop. And from there, wrote several devotionals for law enforcement. But yeah, this latest one, I just graduated seminary, Dallas Theological Seminary in 23. And my thesis, my final paper was on the Levitical blueprint for modern day law enforcement and what that is. And anyway, I had too much to put in the paper, which was really strange for me, but I had so much left over that I wanted to write a book about it. So this book is about how God put the entire blueprint for modern day law enforcement in the Old Testament. And it
Oh,
starts,
wow.
yeah, it is amazing. It starts when Moses leads the Israelites out of Egypt,
Hmm.
and he goes on the mountain. They make the golden calf. He comes down and he says, "Who will?" He draws a line in the sand and he says, "Who will stand for the Lord?" And the Levites cross that line and they say, "We will." And he says, "Well, then strap on a sword and start killing." And I mean, that's not pleasant, but that was the first time the Levites were given the authority to use deadly force. And there are four other times in the Bible where he reaffirms that, take your sword and protect the temple. And if anybody crosses that line, you've got to kill them. So that really started me to thinking about, in the Old Testament, I'm talking from the uniforms that the Levites wear all the way to retirement. All of that is in the Old Testament. And when I started looking at it and really started going through the Old Testament, looking for examples of this, their arrest authority is given in Nehemiah. When you look at Deuteronomy and Exodus, he says their uniforms are to be blue. They're to wear a badge with that represents the community that they are protecting, which is the 12 tribes of Israel. They have these shoulder patches on both shoulders that also represent the people that they protect. It goes into, like I said, retirement. There's only one time retirement is mentioned in the entire Bible, and it's for the Levites. And it says you work 20 years and then you retire. And I was like, oh, that's what I did at Dallas. I worked 20. And then later on, when they have the brick and mortar temple, David changes it from 20 to retire to 25 and retire. And so when I moved to DFW Airport, I laughed. I'm like, oh my gosh, now my retirement's 25 and out. So it just mirrored that. But like I said, the arrest authority, the authority to use deadly force. Even in Nehemiah, he tells them sometimes you have to break the law to enforce the law, because he tells them when the traders come in and camp outside of Jerusalem and they come in and try and trade on the Sabbath, you have to go to, instead of obeying the Sabbath laws, you've got to go to work on the Sabbath and keep these guys from bringing their trades in. And if they don't, then arrest them. So when I'm sitting on the side of the road running radar and somebody passes me doing 70 and a 55, I can't just go 55 and catch up to them. I have to break the law doing 80 or 90 to catch up to them to stop them, to make sure that they slow down. Either they comply or I give them a citation, but I have to break the law to enforce the law. So even that is in the Old Testament. And it's just amazing. If you look at it, the Levites are part of the original 12 tribes of Israel. But when God takes them, when they cross that line, God says, "You are now my chosen firstborn. I'm going to take you out of the 12 tribes and you're completely separate." So from that point on, the Levites were never part of the 12 tribes. If you read the Old Testament, it will say the Israelites, the Levites, and the priests, because they were not part of the 12 tribes. Just like sometimes in law enforcement, as you know, we're almost outside of society to enforce the laws and keep people safe inside the society. So it's so rich. It's incredible how the Levites mirror our calling for modern day law enforcement. But thanks for letting me share that. I appreciate it.
Oh, absolutely. And I learned a long time ago from a teacher said if you go a full day and don't learn anything new, it's a waste of a day. I just learned a bunch of new stuff, so I'm good for the next 2 weeks.
Man, that what a compliment. I appreciate that.
Anyone listening, make sure you go to the show notes after listening to this episode and get that book. But I'll include a link to the AWA website as well. Chuck, I can't thank you enough for coming on the podcast. Do you have any last words of encouragement? And also, please share with people in case they are driving down the road. We want to put that mental nugget in where they can find help from the AWA, like the website and your books and stuff like that.
Yeah, just and this is for all cops, male, female, cops, first responders, military guys, veterans. 1 Corinthians 16:13 and 14 says, be on your guard, stand firm in the faith, be courageous, and be men. And then that little verse that follows it, verse 14 says, and do all of this in love. That really changed things for me. I realized that I could be on my guard. I could be strong and courageous. I could be a man. I could be a warrior, and I could still do this in love. So God, just like we talked about, he provides a way for you to do the job that he has called you to, and just know that he's proud of you. I think that's so important.
Well, definitely. And, I remember hearing at church one day, it's not like God is perfect and God is God. It's not like he needs us and it's just like any other parent who hates to see their children astray. He's the same way, but it's not like he needs us. He is God. However, when you open your life and your heart to him, by gosh, he's going to be there with open arms. And yes, we are supposed to feel that fact that he is proud of us, that he loves us, and that right there is what we need ultimately. And the blessing is also that he can put the right people in our life if we do not harden
Yes.
our hearts and we find them. It's just amazing. I appreciate that. And what is the AWA website? Where can people find your books?
AWA/USA.org. And once you get into that site, you can scroll about halfway down and it says apply here. And it immediately takes you to a set of dates where you can pick which trip would be best for you. You apply. I'm telling you, we got people in the office that will get it immediately. And usually within 2 or 3 days, they call you back and they said, we got it. Let me ask you some questions and let's get you signed up. And it really, most guys are really shocked at how fast it happens and how quick they're in a trip. They'll be like, man, I called 3 days ago and here I am Monday. I'm on a trip. So, but the books, Walmart.com, Amazon.com, BarnesandNoble.com. I think they're being carried in Barnes and Noble stores right now. So thank you for that. Yeah.
All right. Heck yeah. Anytime. All right. Well, thanks again, Chuck. This was awesome.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Thank you for tuning in and listening to another episode of the 10 Code Mindset podcast. If you find this podcast helpful, please give it a 5-star rating, particularly on Apple Podcast platform, and I would greatly appreciate it. That way we can ensure it gets to many more first responders as a support for them. I look forward to talking to you again in the next episode. Take care of yourself, and may God bless.